Chag Purim Sameach, everyone. That's Hebrew for happy or joyous Purim feast. Although Purim is not one of the feasts of the Lord, it is a biblical feast. As we will see when we get to the end of the Purim story recounted in the book of Esther, one of the heroes of the story, Mordecai, sent an edict to all the Jews throughout the Persian kingdom, and I read, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them. That's reading from Esther 9, verses 21 through 23. So, we see here on the biblical calendar, Purim falls on the 14th of Adar, the last month on the biblical year. So there we see the month of Adar. We've got all the way around, and there's Purim right in the middle of Adar. If you viewed our Adar message in the Biblical Calendar series, you'll have learned that 7 times in a 19-year period, there are 2 Adars forming a leap year. And when that occurs, Purim falls in Adar 2. It always occurs 30 days before Passover, which is on the 14th of Nisan, right here, the first month of the new biblical year. All the events pertaining to Purim are set out in the book of Esther. It's also referred to as the Scroll of Esther, or in Hebrew, it's referred to as the Megillah Esther. In Jewish tradition, the whole Megillah, that's where that expression comes from. The whole Megillah is read at night and again the following morning, preceded by the reading of 3 blessings. For the most part, I'll just summarize the events of the scroll, but allow me first to make a few more observations. The story unfolds over a period of 9 years, occurring in one of the darkest times in the history of the Jewish people. The temple had been destroyed and the Jews carried off into captivity. No doubt many of them felt abandoned by God. Perhaps they felt they had fallen too far for His grace to reach them. Had they disqualified themselves from the prophecies and promises of God? A particularly interesting fact is that the name of God does not appear anywhere in the whole Megillah of Esther. Nevertheless, when the story is fully read, it's clear that God never left or forsook them. It becomes abundantly clear that even when His presence seems hidden, His hand is working behind every scene, and He is the architect of their miraculous deliverance. There are some similarities between the Feast of Purim and the Feast of Hanukkah, and even the conditions leading up to the conflicts and deliverance that the Jewish people were subjected to. A main difference is that the story of the events celebrated by Hanukkah is not related in the Bible, since it occurred between the close of the Hebrew Scriptures and the start of the New Testament or Apostolic Scriptures. The events leading to the Feast of Purim are fully narrated in the Scriptures, as we'll soon see. It's clear from the New Testament Scriptures in John 10, verses 22 through 24, that Yeshua celebrated Hanukkah, describing His visit to the temple in Jerusalem for the Feast of Dedication. Some commentators believe He was also in Jerusalem to celebrate Purim in the account of John chapter 5, verse 1 and following. That account describes His attendance at an unnamed feast of the Jews when He healed a man at the pool of Bethesda, a man who had suffered with an infirmity for 38 years. If you viewed our Adar message, you will have learned that Adar is a month of increasing joy and optimism. Purim is certainly a high point of the month in every sense. In Jewish custom, it's a time to dress up in costumes, feast and party, and have a joyous family and community celebration. Presents are sent to friends and gifts given to the poor, just as we read in Scriptures a few moments ago. Some even put on corny theatrical productions of the story, and when the scroll is read and the name Mordecai comes up, the crowd cheers. At the name of Haman, they boo loudly and bang on pots and pans or make a clatter with noisemakers called groggers. Now, to our story. The setting for these events is described in Esther chapter 1, verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. So here we see a map of the approximate boundaries of his rule, India to Ethiopia. Verse 2 tells us, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel, Shushan may have looked something like this. The story continues in verses 3 and 4, that in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. Our king is clearly showing off and wanting to impress his guests and make a big impression. Now for his crowning trophy. Jumping ahead to verse 10, still in chapter 1. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded his 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. Now, some people were very critical of the rebellious Queen Vashti, they thought, but before we judge her too harshly, let me point out that some commentators believe that the king called for Vashti to be brought to him wearing only her crown, meaning she would have otherwise been completely naked. She was renowned for her great beauty, and this may have been his way of parading his trophy queen to be leered at by the other men. Obviously, his pride was wounded and he was outraged. After consultation with his advisors, he issued a decree that forever banished Vashti from his presence. After a time, his wrath subsided, and his servants advised that beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. The idea was to gather out all the most beautiful maidens in his kingdom and bring them to the palace in Shushan, where the most beautiful among them would be chosen as the new queen in place of Vashti. This may have been the prototype for our modern Miss Universe contests. At this time, there was a Jewish man called Mordecai who had been among the Jews taken captive from Jerusalem to Babylon during the invasion by Nebuchadnezzar. We read from Esther chapter 2, verse 7, and Mordecai brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Hadassah was her Hebrew name, meaning myrtle or myrtle tree, though she had been given a Persian name, Esther. Not surprisingly, Esther is one of the women taken to be a prospective queen for Ahasuerus. She is greatly favored by the custodian of the virgins, who gives her many advantages over the other maidens. Following the instructions of her guardian Mordecai, Esther conceals her family origins. In other words, she does not disclose that she is Jewish. All the virgins were subjected to 12 months of preparation before they were presented to the king. Then each woman was sent to spend a night with the king. After he had tried her out, she would not go in to him again unless he requested her. Predictably, Esther found favor with the king above all the others, and he loved her. He crowned her as his queen, threw a great feast for her, and proclaimed a holiday. She continued to keep her Jewish identity a secret. Now, while sitting in the king's gate, Mordecai overheard a plot by 2 of the king's servants. He told Esther, who told the king. After an investigation, the men were hanged, and the matter was written up in the king's book of Chronicles. Meanwhile, the king promoted a man named Haman above all the other princes and commanded that people should bow and pay homage to him. Mordecai could not comply, being forbidden to do so by the laws of God. This was reported to Haman, with the reason given that he was a Jew. In great anger, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews in the kingdom. They cast meaning lots, to determine the date on which they would carry out this deed, and it fell on the 12th month, the month Adar. Next, Haman reported to the king that a certain group of people refused to obey the king's commands, and he persuaded the king to issue a decree to annihilate all the Jews on the 13th of Adar. The decree went out to every province. Upon receiving the news, Mordecai went into mourning. He sent word to Esther through one of her attendants, urging her to intercede with the king on behalf of her people. However, Esther hesitated, knowing that if any person approached the king without his invitation, they could be put to death. But Mordecai continued to admonish her with these famous words: "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" So Esther conceded, asking Mordecai to call the surrounding Jews to a 3-day fast, after which she would approach the king, though this put her life at risk. She ended her reply saying, "And if I perish, I perish." After 3 days, she dressed up and went to the inner court of the king's palace. We're now in chapter 5, and from verses 2 and 3 we read, "So it was, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, 'What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, up to half the kingdom.'" Apparently, Queen Esther had received a strategy from the Lord, for she merely invited the king and Haman to attend a banquet that she had prepared for Haman. They gladly attended. Instead of making her request known at that opportunity, Esther simply invited them to a second banquet the following day. Haman and his family rejoiced at this good fortune, but his joy was dampened by his indignation at Mordecai, who still refused to pay him homage. His wife and friends counseled him to build a gallows on which to hang Mordecai. This idea pleased Haman, who arranged to have the gallows made. That same night, the king couldn't sleep, so he asked for the book of Chronicles to be brought to him and read to him. Along the same idea as counting sheep, I imagine. They read to him the account of Mordecai exposing the plot to assassinate the king. The king discovered that there had been no recognition to Mordecai for his good deed, so he called for Haman for his advice. When he asked Haman what would be a suitable reward to honor a man with whom the king was pleased, Haman was sure this was about him, of course, and he, I quote, answered the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken." Much to his chagrin and shame, Haman was required to carry out this command. He returned home thoroughly humiliated, but was quickly summoned by the king's eunuchs to attend Esther's second banquet. A long story short, at the banquet, the king again asked what was Esther's request. She entreated him that her life and the lives of her people be spared. Then she carried on to expose Haman's plot to destroy all the Jews. The king was enraged. One of the king's servants pointed out that Haman had built a gallows to hang Mordecai, who had served the king well, and the king declared that Haman should be hanged on it. Yay! The king then promoted Esther and Mordecai and even gave his signet ring to Mordecai, who replaced the wicked Haman in his office. Esther threw herself at the mercy of the king on behalf of all the Jews to reverse the decree that was crafted by Haman. Though a decree sealed with the king's ring cannot be by law revoked, Mordecai wisely crafted a decree that trumped the earlier decree by allowing the Jews to arm and defend themselves on the date of the decree, the 13th of the 12th month Adar. They rose up and overthrew their enemies handily. Even the king's officials and leaders aided the Jews, and many citizens became Jews themselves. Throughout the kingdom, the Jews were rejoicing, feasting, and celebrating, and sending each other presents. Mordecai became very famous and rose to great prominence throughout the region. Esther chapter 9, verses 20 through 28 tell us, "And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews near and far who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor." So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them, and had cast Pur, that is, the lot, to consume them and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. So they call these days Purim, after the name Pur. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter and what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants and all those who would join them, that's us, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. And so it continues. Even unto this day, thousands of years later, the Jewish people continue to celebrate Purim all over the world. Of course, food is part of every party, and for Purim, the obligatory treat is hamantashen, a triangular-shaped pastry pictured here. Depending on the source, they are said to represent Haman's ears or his pockets or the three-pointed hat he purportedly wore. And in keeping with Mordecai's decree in the Jewish heart, the festival is also an occasion of giving gifts, especially to the poor. The Jewish people dress up in costumes and hold parties and parades. They often disguise themselves as characters from the book of Esther, as Queen Esther herself or Mordecai, Haman, even the king. So there we have a brief overview of the story, the observances and the celebration of the biblical feast of Purim. It was tempting as I pored over the Megillah of Esther to really expound on the lessons, the revelation and applications of this wonderful historical story, but it would have taken several messages to do justice to the book. If I were to attempt to summarize it all In a few words, I'd have to say that Purim reminds us that the Jewish people have always had enemies who, throughout time, have had the singular goal of wiping them off the face of the earth. We saw this in the Passover story, the story of Hanukkah, and there are countless other examples throughout history. Even today, Israel and the Jews have many enemies trying to deny their rights, to justify the persecution and even annihilation. There's no other way to understand this except to realize there is an underlying satanic plot behind it all. In ancient times, the devil thought that perhaps he could prevent Yeshua, the Messiah, from arising on the scene if he could wipe out the messianic bloodline, the Jews. When that failed and Yeshua lived, died, and rose again, Satan continued to target the Jews, for Yeshua foretold that he will not return until they say, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. If there are no Jews alive to proclaim that invitation, the return of Messiah can be thwarted, the only one who can condemn Satan to the lake of fire. But God, though he was somewhat hidden behind the scenes in the Megillah of Esther, he clearly orchestrated the demise of Haman, protecting the Jews in Shushan from destruction. Today, in an age of increasing anti-Semitism, he will continue to preserve his chosen people. But we who are of the church must intercede before the throne of our King in prayer on their behalf. For who knows but that we have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Thank you so much for joining us for this message as we approach the end of this series, The Biblical Feasts and Seasons. Some might expect this to be the last message in this series, but we have one more to go, Biblical Shabbat. Did you know that Shabbat is a feast of the Lord? Well, stay tuned to find out. Until next time, shalom, and God bless to you all.